Today, I'm excited to talk to you about circadian biology, light, and mood. I've done a lot of research, and so I'm holding up these notes because I just want to make sure that I don't miss out on some interesting information that you're going to hear today. Light is a very important part of circadian biology because light is what sets our circadian rhythm and patterns in place. So, obviously, the most important part of this is natural light or ambient light rather than indoor lighting, which tends to be a lot less bright than sunlight. So the main part of the brain that is responsible for our circadian clock is a small tiny structure which is about 0.25 cubic millimeters, and there are two of them, called the suprachiasmatic nucleus. This contains something known as a molecular oscillator, and it has two interconnected loops, feedback loops. Obviously, the suprachiasmatic nucleus is linked to the main sensor of light, which is our eyes. Within the retina, we have certain specialized cells which have only recently been discovered, called the intrinsic photosensitive ganglionic retinal cells. And these cells are particularly sensitive to light. In fact, the rods and the cones, particularly the cones, which are the receptors for color vision, are connected to the brain through these photosensitive ganglion cells, and these influence our wakefulness. And the suprachiasmatic nucleus is the part of the brain, in fact the part of the hypothalamus, that is a key mediator of everything to do with our circadian rhythms and our sensitivity and reaction to light and dark. In addition to that, the suprachiasmatic nucleus controls and is connected to various other parts of the brain and the body. The other parts of the brain that are connected are something known as the pineal gland, which you all may have heard of, which is the seat from which melatonin is released. And it's also connected to something known as the raphe nucleus, which is the nucleus that is responsible for the release of serotonin. So serotonin and melatonin are actually interrelated chemicals. In fact, melatonin is produced from serotonin, and serotonin is responsible for a sense of calm and peace. And you can see that how serotonin and melatonin are therefore closely interrelated, because melatonin is the hormone of sleep, which induces the onset of sleep. There are also certain what is called non-photic inputs into the suprachiasmatic nucleus. This comes from something known as the geniculo-hypothalamic tract. Now, these are non-photic stimuli which are relayed to the suprachiasmatic nucleus, which also help the suprachiasmatic nucleus regulate the circadian rhythm using stimuli other than light, which could be temperature and various other things. Coming to what actually regulates our circadian clock, there is a German word that describes it very beautifully called Zeitgeber. Zeitgeber is also known as, in English, if you translate it to English, it is what gives time. So what gives time to us as humans is the light and dark cycle that one encounters because of the natural sunrise and sunset that makes our 24-hour day on planet Earth. So obviously sunlight exposure is an important part of what regulates our circadian rhythms. Now the suprachiasmatic nucleus, because it is part of the hypothalamus, it's part of the limbic system, it has a way of communicating with various other parts of the body using various chemicals, which can be hormones, they can be neurotrophic factors, it can be through the autonomic nervous system, and also through various cytokines. Surprisingly, during my research into this topic, I got to learn that there are some things known as peripheral clocks in other tissues of the body, including the liver, the kidneys, the skin, the gastrointestinal tract, reproductive organs, and so on. And these peripheral clocks are obviously not regulated by light. They are regulated by things other than light, predominantly things such as body temperature, feeding, and so on. So it's important to understand that there are several factors that regulate our circadian rhythm, the predominant one being light, and other factors being food, temperature, exercise, and so on. So like I said earlier, the suprachiasmatic nucleus is an important regulator of bodily clocks. How does it do this? it usually sends out rhythmic signals which are related to the light and dark cycles using chemicals such as metabolites, prominently NAD, hormones such as cortisol, because we all know that cortisol usually peaks in the early part of the day and falls off in the latter part of the day, cytokines like TGF beta, body temperature, and neuronal signals from the autonomic nervous system. So these are the ways in which the suprachiasmatic nucleus regulates the other peripheral clocks. Now what happens in people who are on a shift kind of work where they do not work the regular daylight hours but they need to work at odd times? Either they start very late at night or they start very early in the morning. There's clearly going to be a significant disruption in their sleep-wake cycles, and their ability to be exposed to natural light is significantly reduced. Speaking of natural light, on a sunny day, if you were to get out into the outer environment outside your room or your house, you would be exposed to approximately 100,000 lux of light. On a cloudy day, maybe about 30,000 lux. Even the brightest indoor lighting in your office or in your home would probably give you not more than 1,000 lux. So when we talk about exposure to light, it's important to realize that exposure to sunlight is a far more powerful stimulus to our circadian rhythm. The other interesting thing about exposure to light is that the suprachiasmatic nucleus summates the amount of light exposure we get in a 24-hour period. So it is a cumulative effect. So the more light you get, the higher the summation. And to get the same amount of summation with artificial light is far more difficult than it is with sunlight. So try to get out into the sun, especially in the early part of your day or towards the latter part of your day. This will not only give you an adequate amount of exposure to natural light, but it will also make it safe to view this sunlight. As Professor Andrew Huberman has said many times on his podcast, it's one of his favorite things to say, get out into the early morning sun or the late setting sun because it's a low solar angle and it is not as damaging to your skin or your eyes as brighter sunlight. So shift work and sleep disorders are very serious issues because they can have widespread effects on human health. There are metabolic effects, there are effects suspected to be related to cancer, there are heart related issues, and there are mental health related issues associated with shift work. Metabolic effects can include many things such as abnormalities in leptin and ghrelin, which is the hormones that regulate hunger and satiety. There are enough studies to show that people who are on shift work have a higher risk of metabolic syndrome, they have worsened insulin sensitivity, they have a worse gut microbiome. There are also some studies which seem to suggest that cancer is a risk factor for people who work on shifts. That is because of altered cellular repair mechanisms, DNA damage, reduced tumor suppression, and so on. Then coming to heart-related issues, there are issues with the hypothalamic pituitary axis, adrenal axis. So if you are not aware already, there is something known as a hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis which exists in our bodies. The hypothalamus is the center that regulates the pituitary gland, and the pituitary gland in turn regulates the adrenal gland. So this axis is very important in terms of regulation of cortisol, adrenaline, noradrenaline. So in people who are on shift work, because of the abnormality in their circadian rhythm, there is an abnormality in their cyclical release of cortisol. And as you know, cortisol is the hormone that's associated with chronic stress. So this leads to endothelial damage, central obesity, hypertension, dyslipidemia, and a whole bunch of other things which increases the cardiovascular mortality for people who are on shift work. The other thing, of course, is mental health. So there are enough studies to show that cortisol abnormalities lead to increased stress reactivity, altered emotional rhythm. So if you have a friend or a relative who's doing shift work, you might notice that they tend to be a little more irritable when they're doing this shift work rather than when they're well rested. And this is really no fault of theirs. It's just the biology of shift work that makes them that way. So they have increased emotional ability or a likelihood of increased emotional ability, poor stress reactivity, and they may tend to be very abrupt and rude at times. This is not really their fault. So how do you figure out the right way to get exposure to sunlight, or how do you figure out the right way to ground your circadian rhythm into something? Obviously, if you live in an area that doesn't get enough sunlight some months of the year, or you're in a situation or a job where you do not get the opportunity to get exposure to enough natural light, then you would have to use another one of the factors that regulates circadian rhythm to ground your schedule using that rather than using light. So what can that be? One is food, the second is temperature, and the third is exercise. So you'll have to use one of these three to help ground your circadian rhythm properly so that you don't have disruptions and alterations in your biology. Obviously, light is the best way, but in the absence of that, these are the other three ways that you can do it. How do you do this? One of the very important things that one must realize is that there is something called a temperature minimum. So just before you wake up in the morning, whatever your typical waking time is, let's say it's 6 a.m. I wake up at 4:30 a.m., which is, most people consider that extremely abnormal. It works perfectly well for me. But if, let's say, you wake up at 6 a.m., which is a more typical wake up time, your temperature minimum will likely occur in the 2 hours before you wake up, your typical wake up time. If you view sunlight within 4 to 6 hours from the time of your temperature minimum. So let's say you view sunlight early in the day. This will cause a phase shift in your circadian rhythm to the point that you will tend to go to sleep a little earlier the next night. Whereas not viewing sunlight in the 4 to 6 hours after your temperature minimum will phase delay your circadian clock. So if you know this, then you can adjust light exposure to help regulate your circadian rhythm. On the contrary, viewing light 4 to 6 hours before your temperature minimum will do the opposite. So if you view light very late into the night before your temperature minimum, then it will again cause a phase delay so that you will tend to sleep later the next night. Whereas if you do not view light, it will cause a phase advancing of your circadian clock. So this is a great tool that Professor Huberman has also spoken about in his podcast. And it's a way that you can figure out how to adjust your clock, especially if you're suffering from jet lag. Another way of dealing with jet lag is to try and adjust your food intake to the local food times in the new place that you're in. Because that will, again, like I mentioned, food helps to regulate your peripheral clocks, and that will also help you to adjust to your new time zone. If you know your new time zone beforehand, trying to adjust your phase advance or phase delay your clock using light is another great tool to get into a circadian rhythm which is more well adjusted to your new time zone. So using the temperature minimum again, you can either phase delay or phase advance your circadian clock. I'd like to point out before I end that there is new evidence that shows that there's a pathway actually which goes directly from your retina to a part of your brain called the habenula, which I've spoken about on my Instagram channel on an earlier reel. But this goes directly from your retina to your habenula. And viewing light in the timing between 11 p.m. and 3 a.m. can affect your lateral habenula and lead to mental health issues, particularly depression. So it's a great idea to keep the lights dim in your sleeping environment, particularly towards the latter half of your day, closer to your sleep time. Using red light, using blue blockers are also good strategies to reduce light exposure in the latter half of your day, which will help to not suppress the melatonin that normally comes from exposure to light. So if you allow your melatonin levels to rise naturally towards the evening, and avoiding caffeine, of course, is a big thing. So preferably, no matter how well insulated you think you are to the effects of caffeine, it's a great idea not to consume any caffeinated beverage for at least 8 hours before your bedtime, because it's known to block adenosine receptors, which can affect your sleep. So these are many of the ways that one can help understand, because understanding this itself is a great, powerful tool for you to manipulate these things on your own and for you to understand the biology behind the circadian rhythm to help you normalize your circadian biology, because sleep is a foundational strategy for improving your health. Not only your health, it also improves your cognition, it improves so many health metrics and your recovery after exercise as well. So I think amongst all the things that we talk about There's so many advances in medicine, great technological advances in treatment of various diseases, but there are certain foundational things that we must keep in mind. I think sleep is definitely one of the big ones, exercise is another, diet is a third, but sleep and exercise are two of the most important foundational elements of good health. And using this information and knowledge of your circadian biology will really go a long way in ensuring that your sleep is not disrupted at least 80% of the time. And that will improve your health by leaps and bounds. So check out the videos below, related topics for you to understand a little bit more about what we do on this channel and the information we'd like to disseminate. Do like and please subscribe to the channel, because subscription to the channel means motivation to me and my team to put out more such interesting videos for you to benefit from. And do share them with your friends and family, because we're here to help you improve your health and take control of your biology.